For the city of Portsmouth, and I would like to ask our fellow councilors here if they have any questions. Who would like to go first?
Your Honor, the first thing I would like to just mention that on camera is that we don't have a quorum this morning because it was optional for council members to be here. We're going to have another session on these questions for the draft of the revised zoning ordinances. So it is more or less a informal session. It is not, because there is no quorum, we will just record when the council meeting was convened and then indicate that there was no quorum. And I would entertain just opening up the questions as you mentioned. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
Councilor Spear.
Thank you. Before I have a lot of detailed individual questions. Before I get into that, kind of in the broadest sense, a few months ago, maybe almost a year ago, Councilor Kennedy, Reynolds, and myself sent a letter to the planning board talking about whether to require certain sustainable building practices, or that the city should encourage certain practices. And the motivation was there was a report, the Green Buildings Report, is that the name of it exactly? That came out and I talked about the expense. It was a very modest expense to have green buildings. And that was motivation for us, we three councilors at the time, because we were concerned that we had read somewhere that the planning board was considering more of an encouragement stand. And that, in fact, is reflected in these ordinances. There's a lot of incentives, there's a lot of encouragement, but not much in the sense of requirement or insistence upon certain green building practices. So just the three of us sent that letter last year, and now it's been a year, and again, I was disappointed to see not more requirement stuff in here, and instead there's more encouragement stuff in here. However, in the meantime, I've been talking to some planning board members, I'm talking to John Ritchie, trying to get an understanding of their mindset. Why are they doing that, going in that direction, as opposed to requiring it? Because the end result, as the opening statement talks about, is to have a more sustainable built environment. And so I think everyone agrees on the goal. It's just how do we get there? And we're differing on approaches. So I think I understand the idea behind behind having incentives and encouragement. It allows for flexibility, for site review, flexibility for the planning board to encourage developers to do these things without scaring them away with requirements. I understand where that's going. However, I still think there's a place for requiring things. And I think it'll be, if I look at an example of the library, where it was a struggle. It was not initially embraced to have a LEED certified library or whatever. And then, but now that it's been done, things kind of steamrolled, and now the fire station is going to be, in the middle school probably will be high performance, and these things snowball. Perhaps we could do the same approach for our zoning ordinances, in the sense of having required sustainable practices for a subset of our built environment. We could pick either a region, like the CBD, or a size thing, like greater than 5,000 square feet or something, or pick some sort of size or type or region that says, okay, these are going to be built with green practices. Now, I don't know what those green practices are. I mean, there's a lot of things out there that could focus on LEED, could focus on lid, other types of things. But the essence of moving from encouraging and having that flexibility to a requiring. And if we can get there at baby steps, I think that would be even better than what's been proposed here. So as we go through, I want to say that first, because as we go through here, there are a lot of things I noticed and I wrote down that were in the incentive area that I thought, hey, why are we incentivizing? That should be required. That's so obvious. That should be required. So now I wanted to open with that because now when I go through this and I say those things, maybe we can think of that with that in mind, and that it could be required not for everybody, but maybe for this, however we determine some sort of subset of green requirements would apply to certain types, regions, or sizes of structures. So I don't know if Jerry had any thought about that.
I agree with the sentiment. I'd be curious as to what the comments are from either Cindy or Rick, because we did, when I was on the planning board, did debate this, and there was some reluctance. Some people wanted to be stronger about it, some did not, and I left the planning board, so I want her to bring me up to speed on what happened. So, at one point, you were suggesting that we move it into the building codes.
Right, and
A lot of lead practices.
maybe we can respond in two ways. Maybe, Rick, if you want to talk about what's in there a little bit, because there are some mandatory things in terms of lead practices in site review. And then maybe Rick Hopley could talk a little bit about the building code and the green that's in that and what's going to be coming forward with that. And we should come sit up here.
I guess maybe both of you made a summary of how we got here, which was kind of a discussion within the planning board about which things, how far to go in terms of mandating things versus encouraging them, and pretty much hit it on the head. So it was that back and forth, and we got to where we are. It was also the discussion and a lot of, as you referred to, a lot of information that I learned during the process is how much green is being developed in the building code, and it's kind of evolving. Rick and probably talked about in terms of the fact that the building code is kind of, the international building code is continually being updated, and more things are being added to it. So it's emphasizing more and more of that sustainability aspect. And so some of the things that in terms of green building practices are really not appropriate for the zoning, they're more appropriate looking at building codes. Some of the aspects that have to do with site development really do belong in the site review regulations, because that's where you look at how a site is developed. And what we try to do in the zoning ordinance is to provide those options for people's, for example, we did this Central Business A district, which is giving some more density if the building at a certain need level, or in this proposed gateway district where we're providing an optional form of development, but you have to meet a lead requirement, a lead neighborhood development requirement, so that there's a new aspect of the LEED program that's not focused on buildings, but more focused on site and area development. But as Cindy mentioned, in the site review regulations, the areas that are focused on low impact development and maintaining stormwater on site and that sort of thing are where the real focus is in terms of green. And I think, and that's actually another point to look at is that you were talking about green development, green building, and green can have to do with energy, which it often does, but it also has to do with stormwater management in terms of low impact development. So there's all different aspects of that. I'm not sure is there anything else in terms of site review that we should be mentioning in that?
The only other comment I'd made to sort of get to what you said, Jerry, is that the discussion the planning board had, and I wouldn't want to speak for the whole board, but was that we have to find that balance of not killing off economic development, but being more sustainable. And I don't think that the planning board felt that this was the right time to go ahead with mandatory lead, and that was the general sense of the board. Because, and I think I can probably speak for the board on that because that's why it's not in there. That the board decided the better approach would be to slowly incorporate these things and incentivize, particularly in this climate. But maybe Rick can speak to the building code aspect.
Well, everything that has been said about the model codes in the country are absolutely true. The greenification of the codes is an ongoing effort nationally. This definitely has national momentum, and we see it with every new edition of not only the building code, but the mechanical, the plumbing code, the International Conservation and Energy Code, which this is the 2006 currently enforced in the state, and the 2009 is already published, and there's been some I've heard some talk about trying to expedite its adoption in the state. With every new edition of these model codes comes areas that are somewhat more restrictive in what you have to do, whether it's the amount of insulation, whether it's the efficiency of the equipment. The codes are also trying to build in options to do systems differently than what has been traditionally thought of. Similar to the library where we had waterless urinals, that was never talked about in the plumbing code just a few years ago. And now that, and so it may not have been allowed, but now it is talked about and it is accepted, and the technology has advanced so that we can feel relatively assured that the sanitation is going to be taken care of with that type of a fixture. So it is very much evolving. Now, having said that, I will say that the model codes haven't gone to the point of mandating. Be this level or achieve this many points. There's also a new standard, National Green Building Standard, which was a joint partnership between the International Code Council, that's the ICC, and the National Association of Home Builders. Again, and I've read through this, and there's nothing that says you have to get to star 1 or star 4, but it gives you ways to achieve that in various different elements of the building process, whether it's the site placement, or whether it's the equipment, and whether it's the building envelope for the insulation. So, Cindy was right. It is a delicate balancing act, so that is to try to encourage the sustainable practices, but then not stymie the development. There's been a couple of cases I'm pretty sure I'm aware of that developers have started out on the lead path and have quickly realized that economically it wasn't going to be a viable way of going in the end. I'm not actually sure. I'll need to do some digging to find out, in at least one case out to Pease, a building that now is complete, whether they were able to achieve any sort of certification. And they were doing that on their own as a marketing tool to get clients into their building. So,
Rick, isn't it true that it's not the elements that are going into the building, people are putting the elements into the building. It's just the whole putting together the lead application and the Energy Council, is it?
Yes.
Where we have to go through. I think there is a lot of things you have to fill out, and a lot of developers, the architects and others, just to fill out the paperwork costs. I think Dan Hartree, we might even want to ask Dan to give us something on that, but I think it costs to $10,000 to $15,000, maybe $20,000 just to go through the application process. And talking to people, in fact, one you mentioned out at Pease, they've incorporated a lot of the elements. There were 3 buildings out there that they were looking at going after LEED certification. Then they found out what it took to get the certification. They continued to do the things in the building, but didn't go through the technical LEED certification because they just felt, number one, it was time consuming and it was delaying their project because they have to come out and they have to get the point system in place. And number two, that the cost of getting all those documents together just seemed to the developer to be not really productive for them, especially with the economy the way it is. So in the city, you know, we've done, as you indicated, the library, we're going to do the fire station. We've internally had somebody go through and get certified, Dan Hartree, and he did that on his own, basically out of frustration because of the process. I mean, we actually supported him in doing that. So that's one of the things you're finding. I don't think that people are resistant to putting the sustainable items in the building. It's just that they don't want to go through the whole bureaucracy of getting it done. So that's kind of main. So when you use the word lead, people kind of get a little concerned only because of possible delay of their project. But if you show them the elements, which I think the building code is trying to address,
I think more and more you're gonna see people put those in because it makes sense.
I think to your point, I'm on the board of the Children's Museum, and we just got LEED Silver certification. It took a year of submitting documents to LEEDs, and we estimated $50,000.
Wow.
I think you're more
So it
accurate
cost
on that.
$50,000 to get the certificate, even
And-
though the building was built
And
with
there-
all the LEED stuff.
there is
So there is
value,
this
yeah.
problem with spending all this money to get this document, which
There-
doesn't save any energy. It's actually the equipment that you put into the building and the design of the building that saves all the money.
Absolutely, right, there is.
And therein lies a problem that if we could solve, because I think we all want sustainable buildings, and Eric called it the right thing. Instead of LEEDs, we should sustainable or green buildings.
Well, it
Come
should
up
be
with some
through the,
mechanism.
they're probably better off being through the building code, and coming up in the next, hopefully August 17th, Rick is gonna come before you. I'm gonna do a kind of introduction presentation on some of the changes that we're gonna propose to the building code, because there are some national standards that have changed. And I'm sure there will be some green practices within that. And when it's in the code, I think people are more inclined, okay, we'll deal with it in the code, rather than having to, as Councilman Monick said, go through the whole process. There is value for municipalities and nonprofits that get that validation, because there's a lot of people that have donated, or the taxpayer wants to validate what we're saying.
But it was shocking how expensive it was.
Yeah, it is.
Decided to do it.
For a nonprofit, that's a lot of money to spend
And
on
To
something.
spend for a piece of paper.
Right, and we saved a lot of money, like I said, Dan's done a lot of the work on himself, internally, so. That's just kind of what I've heard, that's all.
I think a lot of that cost is going to go down because there have been so few LEED certified professionals, and it's been a process that's been developing. As I said, the LEED ND program is still in pilot, so all of these programs are developing as people are getting certified. So I would suspect that in 5 years, the cost of getting LEED certification is going to be a quarter of what it is today. Just because there's going to be so many more people doing it, it's going to be more of a routine process. More people have gone through and had the experience, but right now anybody who's doing it is pretty much a pioneer, so it costs more.
One of the other areas is the Energy Star area through the Department of Energy, and we're internally looking at that. It's a different type of process.
And there are a number of, I mean, when you look at that would be more of a building, on the building side, but on the site development side, it will be more related to zoning. There are other things. There's another program called Sustainable Sites, which is kind of a parallel to LEED, which has been developed by some other organizations. There are a couple of others too. So LEED is not the only thing that's out there, but you know, the general category of sustainability is met by a number of these things.
Eric, do you have anything else you would like
I
to
do.
ask? I'm sure you do.
So anyway, that was just an overall thing, and I'll bring it up from time to time as we go on the individual items. So now, stepping away from that for a minute, on the permitted uses, which is a great chart.
Can you tell us what page you're on?
Yeah, 17. And this is true for actually 17 and let's see, 23 talks about medical services and personal services, and then there's undertakers, retail trade, convenience goods, all the permitted uses. We have, I see that they're not permitted in the residential. A lot of these are simply not permitted in the residential. Sometimes special exceptions, but usually not permitted. And I thought that was too restrictive. There's a lot of, in my own neighborhood and other neighborhoods around town, there are a lot of businesses right within the neighborhoods, and I think they fit the character of the neighborhood. For example, you might have a dentist who might then have 2 or 3 employees, receptionist, hygienist. Undertakers, there's funeral homes right in residential areas, and I think they fit the neighborhood just fine. Convenience goods stores, right? Again, in my neighborhood, there's a few convenience goods stores. Now, all of these share the characteristic that they share the characteristics of the fabric of the neighborhood. It's not like when I say convenience goods store, I don't mean putting a Rite Aid in downtown Atlantic Heights, right? That wouldn't fit. But I think these businesses, they add to the social capital of the community. They add security because a lot of times in communities during the business hours, no one's there. These businesses would be there with eyes and ears on that street, on that little, 2-block radius neighborhood. And they can reduce traffic because, again, the idea being some of these businesses would be satisfying the needs of the immediate neighborhood. They're not drawing people from out of town to go to their business. So people don't have to drive across town to go to whatever business. They can go right next door. Maybe they can even walk to this business. So I thought that was lacking, and so I know this happened recently on my own street. The little business there, which has been a business for 40 years as a kind of a convenience food emporium, had to get a variance to continue to exist because they had a change of ownership and things like that. But I don't think that should be the case. I think those types of businesses should be encouraged in neighborhoods. So anyway, I wanted to know again what you guys thought about that, other councilors thought about that, and what the planning staff thought about that.
Well, in a number of cases, we probably debated every single cell of this table. And I think there were a number of areas where we talked about increasing uses, not so much necessarily in the strictly residential neighborhoods, although we did have some of those areas, but more in the mixed residential, the MRO and MRB. And I think it was just not a level of comfort with expanding. What you see here is fairly, in many cases, is similar to what's in the existing ordinance, and we tried to kind of raise some of those issues. But there was discomfort, I think, in the planning board about adding commercial uses, broadly defined, any type of commercial use to these neighborhoods. I think convenience goods was one of those areas, and I think that I can't remember where that is in terms of the mixed residential. That's right. They are in the MRD, not in the MRO. So they're 23.
Yeah.
But you're right. The residential areas were pretty much strictly left to residential uses or home occupations. For example, a dentist or a doctor could be home occupation as long as they're more traditional. It's the old-fashioned kind of dentist or doctor, not the more modern one with a whole bunch of employees, but the dentist with one assistant working there. So I guess that's a quick sort of question of scale. Like home occupation works on for a very small scale professional use, or for sometimes a very small scale business use. But once it gets beyond a home occupation as a freestanding commercial use, I think there's discomfort with that, and discomfort with the parking, the problems of how you develop a site to meet current parking regulations. That oftentimes parking drives the whole land use issue, especially in congested areas, older congested areas. But it's a point that could be very easily brought up. I mean, the idea of a corner store.
Right, and I've seen these corner stores, and the parking is usually during the day when everyone's at work anyway. There's usually maybe 2 cars at most at any one time because they're 10 minutes. The cars are in there for 10 minutes, they leave. Undertakers, there's 2 funeral homes right in the Lincoln Street. And I think they add in their own way character to the neighborhood. And again, if they were to disappear and you have to get a variance for them to actually come back. So I understand there was some hesitation because people, obviously, and this was mentioned, I think, by the attorney when we began the discussion in the Levinson room. People, when they go into a neighborhood, they expect the character of the neighborhood to be a certain, if it's residential, it should be residential, and you don't want to bring in a lot of things that ruin it. But that's why I say, obviously, if you brought in the type of commercial establishment that would bring a lot of traffic or have a lot of parking problems, you don't want to put a Dunkin' Donuts right in the center of the Woodlands. It wouldn't make any sense. So, but I do think we're losing something if we don't include these type of, I mean, the social capital in these stores is amazing. You go in there and you meet all your neighbors and they're buying things right there, which is a very different experience than going to a Rite Aid or Market Basket. Even though you met Jerry at the Market Basket.
I
guess part of the challenge, just speaking as planning board member, is that how do you let in a little store like you know at the end of your street as okay, but not let a Rite Aid go there? That becomes, you know, not mentioning brand names, but it's really hard to draw that line if you put it as a permitted use in some of those zones, whereas what we have now is they are there through the BOA, which I guess the question is, does that process work?
Well, isn't there between permitted and not permitted the special exception there? So to kind of as a, exactly, we don't really want these things here, but we understand, is that kind of what the special exception is for? How is that used? Is there a way to plug that in
That
there?
special exception, it's allowed by right, right? And maybe.
So it's not allowed by right, it has to meet, the Board of Adjustment has to determine it meets certain criteria, but it's much,
Lower bar.
it's much lower bar than a variance. A variance is more in the sense if it's a hardship or there's something that is, it's a very unique situation about a property. A special exception generally means that it's allowed anywhere in that district, except that you have to meet a test of minimum traffic impact, minimum stormwater impact, you know, environmental, that type of thing, and no detriment to the neighborhood. There's a variety of criteria you have to meet.
So maybe they could be moved into
They could be a special exception, or they, I mean, that's, and I think we actually had, when we had them in there, we had them in as special exception, and I think it was just a concern that was just not enough control, and maybe what you're talking about is trying to define a smaller scale use that is distinct from, you know, that is a drugstore of up to 500 square feet. Or
Right,
something like
exactly.
That. It's different than a drugstore of more than that.
It's very different. Well, I don't know what the other councilors think.
I tend to be conservative in this regard. I think the traffic impacts and the potential for it to get run away with itself. I mean, how do you write these rules? You write a 500-foot, somebody will sue us. I've seen those lawsuits, and all of a sudden you wind up with a hotel. And I think that's how
One of
a
the
hotel got built. A residential neighborhood allowed a lady to have a seamstress. All of a sudden it became business. All of a sudden the hotel went into a residential neighborhood. So this thing can kind of get away with itself unless you write the rules really carefully, and with a lawsuit, the judge can decide what can go and what can't go.
You do-
So I would tend to be conservative in this regard and forego some of the social capital for that neighborhood.
And there is a way to do it if you really, you know, if you apply for the special variance and all that. I mean, you could have that neighborhood convenience store if you
Well,
wanted to.
the difference is the property owner has to express a hardship to get the variance, as opposed to what I'm trying to say is the community is benefiting from having these stores, and that would, what special exception would exist, as opposed to the property owner simply saying, I have a hardship, I need to have this only use for this property. Maybe, so anyway, if it's possible to craft the rules in such a conservative way that would allow, where I'm trying to go, at the same time protect the interests of the neighborhood that Jerry's talking about. Because we don't, exactly, you don't want the camel getting under this note of the tent, and then, I agree, you're doomed. And I don't want that.
You know, when you drive into Atlantic Heights and you see that structure there,
Yeah.
I think most of that is empty, isn't it?
They're struggling to keep those occupied.
I know,
think.
that would,
Yeah.
it would
But it's an
look
ideal
so much
location.
nicer in the neighborhood if that building
I
could have
agree.
a convenient food store or
I
there was a
agree.
real estate place there once, so.
The latest craze there is a beauty shop.
Okay,
Actually, they
something like
put in
that
a
would be nice.
pretty nice, done a lot of improvements to probably a good third of that building. And beauty shops are in the city, and they come and they go and they split, and they're pretty a dynamic operation. And this gal was, I don't think she proprieted another shop, but she was a beautician in another shop, and she decided to go out on her own and pick that location.
Great.
And put some nice improvements into a portion of that. But you're right, there's some portions that are vacant. I think the left-hand side is
Yeah,
vacant.
yeah.
All right.
Anything else,
Yep.
Councilor
Page
Spear?
31. I think I asked this in our meeting, but just TV aerials.
The
I
satellite
don't,
dish?
yeah, it just, again, I'm not a lawyer or a zoning guy, just reading through this, it looked like, oh, TV aerials aren't allowed, because This is talking about things that can be mounted on roofs. But obviously, I don't think the intention is to prohibit the aerials from being there. And they're mentioned somewhere else in the document. It's just that they're not mentioned in this part. So.
I think we had that discussion at planning board, Rick. I wonder if it's in how we define the term. Because clearly the intent was not to not have TV aerial. We can take, yeah, good point. We can take a look at that, just make sure.
Page 32. About farm animals. I know there are some people, not me, but I know there's some people who keep chickens in their yards. Is that, and I read somewhere that is like a trend. Is that looks like it's prohibited if a farm animal is not a pet? I mean, a chicken is not a pet. Well, some people might consider it a pet. I don't know where that comes in there.
It is prohibited, yeah. As a farm animal for raising food or anything like that, it's prohibited in the denser residential areas.
Right.
It's allowed by special exception in the rural and single residence districts, which are the larger areas of the city. If the areas, anything on this map that is like this shade of green, this shade of green, and then this lighter area. So all these green areas, it would be permitted in. Places where it would not be permitted in are this yellow, and then over here, this yellow, this kind of this shade of yellow. So it's more like the denser areas of the city where that's not allowed. It's allowed by special exception in the residential, in the outer residential areas. Majority of the residential areas of the city.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Sure.
Can I?
Yeah.
Now, for instance, in our neighborhood, we have covenants. Now, do the covenants overrule?
Yes.
Okay.
Covenants overrule. And actually, in some parts of the country, covenants are much more. Texas or someplace like that, covenants are much more powerful than zoning. Covenants are relatively. They're not as common they're not really a New England type of thing. They're really they're from imported with condominium developments and that type of thing. But we tend to regulate things more by zoning. But if there is a covenant, it doesn't.
Okay. So I guess we can't have chickens in our neighborhood then.
Some covenants prohibit clotheslines.
I think ours does.
That's a non-sustainable covenant right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
On page, well, I don't know what page, but I want to say one of the things I really liked, and I picked this up at the hearing, not the hearing, but the retreat we had, work session we had, was the idea of the kind of adaptable ordinances that these setbacks and things would take into consideration the blocks that was on. And I thought that was brilliant because it's always struggled with that. There's such a variety of built environment in Portsmouth, and but they all within their own environments look great and appropriate. So that was very.
And one thing I'd like to say about that is that we haven't talked about the zoning map per se very much, but one of the things that we are looking at is the large number of residential neighborhoods in the city that have large numbers of non-conforming lots, where either the setbacks don't comply with zoning, or the lot sizes, the South End, Panaway Manor, Maple Haven, all these, and actually a large number of lots in Elm Park don't conform to the existing zoning because the zoning has evolved and has changed after the neighborhoods are developed. And so we're going to go back and look at those neighborhoods and see if we can't go neighborhood by neighborhood and figure out what the right regulations are for that neighborhood.
Good.
Because it's not a one size fits all. It really is. There are distinct neighborhoods in the city.
Yeah, go.
Before we move past this, page 47, the open space calculation. When the perimeter is large, you're not counting the open space. That's presuming eliminating these little strips between buildings that were counted as open space.
When it becomes a very acute angle, as is shown in A in that illustration, then we would exclude that area as open space. And the purpose it's not for this particular shape. This shape is just to show how that
calculation. A little runway 2 feet wide
Yeah.
20 feet long.
Right,
There
yeah.
wouldn't be any angle, but that wouldn't count either.
Right, and I think we need to, I've actually started this illustration already because we haven't actually shown that case, and that's one thing we need to show is,
Oh, okay.
we need to.
But this is, the purpose is to eliminate.
The purpose is to do that, and one thing that I think I mentioned before is that along with this, we're proposing to eliminate the open space requirement in the central business district because it's really meaningless the way it is.
Thanks.
Council Spear, do
Thank
you have some more questions?
I do. Page 78. Go out ground floor uses. I don't know if I can't remember if I mentioned this at the work session, but this is just in the central business district. The Hanover Street, to me, it's sometimes easy to give an example of the wrong way to do it. And I think the Hanover Street, where between the garage and the hotel, there's an entire block there with absolutely no pedestrian interface on either side of the street. And so you end up with kind of a dead zone. And here, it does talk about they're trying to encourage principal uses, pedestrian uses. I think that's great. But I think there should be an additional requirement for those first floor things that there has to be pedestrian interface, like a door, every so many feet to avoid those dead zones like that. If you compare, just easily walk down that block of Hanover Street and walk down Market Street between Market Square and the Fat Bellies, and just the amount of pedestrian interfaces on that street versus that part of Hanover Street. So just in the CBD, and this is obviously doesn't make sense in the rest of the city, but in the CBD, I think we're trying to keep that pedestrian character. I'd hate for any more dead zones. When you get a developer with a big parcel, they can just wipe it out. So.
And we did talk about that, and I'm not sure we talked about it in site review or in zoning, but one of the things, it's a difficult, we were trying to come up with a standard for a door every 50 feet or a door every 100 feet or something like that, and there were counter arguments that did come up, and we recognize this. The counter arguments were some of the stores that are adding to the vitality of the downtown are stores that are kind of larger stores. So I think the Gap was one that was kind of mentioned as one that would be difficult to meet that standard because of the way the store is laid out. We were saying the character of the city is lots of individual small businesses at ground level, but there are places where that doesn't work, where individual business doesn't work, and we really didn't figure out a way to solve that problem. So we just.
I would think that we shouldn't let the exception become the rule. One large store, if you had all large stores, it'd be terrible. To Eric's point, you want small storefronts, and I thought we had something in the somewhere that mandated a certain maximum size, so that wouldn't get into this problem of too many gaps.
We've talked about that. I think it just never made it.
We never made it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, I think to Jerry's point, we should make it happen. And the Gap is downtown, and they do fine. And I don't want.
We would not want too many gaps.
Right, I don't want
People
those guys
lining up and having great big.
Right.
Block
So
of
anyway,
stores.
I thought that was important to me.
Oh, yes.
Nancy, just as a point, Eric,
Yeah.
your point about pedestrian interface is well taken. I think, Rick, we have to be careful how that's crafted, because in the block that you're talking about, that portion of the building is mechanical equipment oriented and or just not excavated. And so to have a door to a mechanical room doesn't serve your purpose.
Right.
But, we'd have to craft it so that it's not just simply, we want a door.
Right.
Because they could still make an area like that, the mechanical back of the house, so to speak, and have plenty of doors.
Make the letter of the law.
Exactly.
Not the intent.
We did talk a lot about this when we were doing, it was in the zoning part, and we didn't come up with a good solution.
Well, I think it's important enough to try again anyway. But I think the Hanover Street is a lost opportunity, and now that's going to be there for 100 years. So that's what it is.
It's either ledge behind those walls or the mechanical, electrical rooms,
Right.
Elevator, equipment room. That's what's there.
Is it worth it to put a door there just for the aesthetic look of it? Sort of a door that doesn't open?
Well, I
Does
think
that
you
make any
want
sense?
business.
You want
want
commerce.
business there.
You want
interface.
interface.
You want activity.
Yeah,
You want
activity.
activity.
That's just a door.
Yeah.
Doors and windows.
Doors and
Right.
windows, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I guess that's
Next.
also kind of mentioned on page 95, the exact thing is called Building Design Standards, Pedestrian Orientation on 95. And maybe that's the same, it's the same, for them to rehash the same topic, it's just mentioned again in that section.
Yeah, but that one is specifically for the Gateway District. That's-
Okay.
So that is,
Okay.
that's the first place we've actually put that in there. And when we've talked about building design standards, and what happens with this is the Gateway District. We have we're proposing the Gateway District, which would go from the Rye-Town line, at this point, up to the bypass, Lafayette Road, that section. There has been discussion about whether we should include portions of Woodbury. Actually, that came up in the planning board hearing last week, incorporating outer Woodbury Avenue and also incorporating part of the bypass itself into that. So the district is there, and then within that district, what we've created is an optional use that we're calling a gateway plan development. And that's exactly what you were talking about earlier in terms of using incentives rather than mandates. What's listed here as standards, including the site design standards and building design standards, are standards that you have to meet in order to be eligible for the additional density that would be allowed under the gateway plan development. So it's not, it doesn't apply to everything in that district. It only applies to those developments that choose to come in and try to get the higher level of density.
Right.
So it's that question of, again, of incentive versus mandates.
Right. Well, here, under use regulations on page 116, under facilities permitted in all zoning districts, it does mention home television here and access antennas. So I don't know how this corresponds with the use table earlier, but
I'm sorry,
10923.13.
Page
Yes,
116.
yes, right.
So it's in there, but it wasn't in their chart, so I'm not sure how those
Yeah, I think it may have to do with the definition of, we can go back and look at that, but I think it may have to do with the definition of what a wireless telecommunications facility is.
Oh, under definition.
Let me just, I'm not sure whether it's in, no, I think it's actually right at the top of page 116, actually, bottom of page 115. Yeah, the definition of wireless telecommunications facility is fairly limited, bottom of page 115. And I think it's a technical definition. I think it may even come from the Telecommunications Act of 1976.
It doesn't include TVs. TV antennas is the point.
Right, right. It has to do with something that's transmitting back and forth.
Anything else, Eric?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Continue.
Can I give a break at his desk?
Yeah, yeah,
sure.
On page 93, when we're talking about the heights and the distance from the center line of Lafayette Road,
Yes.
how wide is Lafayette Road?
Lafayette Road is variable width, but we talked to the state DOT, and their long-range plan is to come up with a 92-foot cross-section. I mean, 92-foot wide right-of-way. So the point of the
So there, when I guess maybe. So in the bottom where you have 56 feet minimum front yard.
from
10 feet,
56 feet from the center line.
Right.
So if
that
it's
takes
96
into account the extension of the road.
Right, so it's meant to say, right now you've got to define the center line. If we're thinking about a 92-foot wide right-of-way, then you go 46 feet on one side, which is half of 92 feet.
Right.
That establishes your future front lot line.
And this would mean then
10
that
feet back.
you would have 10 feet from the road
Right.
before the building starts.
Yes.
Okay.
10 feet. And the reason for this was to try to get at a more urban scale with buildings in front and parking behind, rather than what you see now in many cases with big parking lots in front and buildings behind.
Right.
And also,
Yeah, I understand the concept. I was trying to figure out
Yeah.
the distance from the center of the road, how wide the road.
Eric, do you want to
Sure.
continue?
Page 127.
Okay, why don't we go till 9 o'clock? So, Jerry, we'll let you pitch in a few minutes, okay? Or
Better go
we'll
on.
let him
I'm kind of
finish.
slipping mine in as we go.
Okay, okay.
Page 127, and this is going to get to some of the environmental stuff I've been talking about. Item number 8 is to promote the use of best management practices, and that could be changed to require the use of best management practices and low impact development. Yeah, sure.
Where is that again?
This is page 127.
In what section, number 1?
On the number 8.
Okay.
It says
Promote
to
use of best
promote the use, I say to require the use of best management practices and low impact development. On page 129, let's see. The following uses are permitted in wetlands, wetland buffers. When it mentions impervious surface, the paving with porous asphalt is something we might not want. Because it's porous, people say, "Oh, it's pervious. Oh, we can use that all over the place." And really, it's not the same thing as a natural surface. And so I wasn't sure about the wording of this, but I don't want that to be seen as a green light to go and pave over all of our buffers with porous asphalt just because it's porous. But it does say, you know what I mean? So.
If I can just clarify,
Yeah.
I think it says the following use, it's kind of a confusing sentence because it's actually saying it's not permitted, correct me if I'm wrong, because it says the following uses are permitted in wetlands buffers, and it says any use that does not involve the use of impervious surface.
Impervious, right, but I don't even want pervious.
He doesn't want pervious asphalt.
Gotcha.
But I was just looking at the definition of impervious, and it says a surface covered by impenetrable materials such as asphalt, concrete, brick. Maybe the issue is that because it is, I think this raises, it's not as clear cut because it says impenetrable materials such as asphalt. The question is porous asphalt an impenetrable material such as asphalt, or is it different than that? So,
Different.
Right. So maybe we should say that does not include any paving or something like that.
Right,
You know,
right.
it
Well,
doesn't-
it does here say, will not alter the natural surface configuration by the addition of fill or dredging. You could put a comma or paving. Maybe that would take care of this.
Let's talk
But
to
think about
the
it.
environmental planner
Yeah,
about
think
that
about it.
because, you know, the state, the shoreline regs, they don't consider gravel impervious. They don't consider
Okay.
gravel impervious, but they do consider pervious as an okay surfacing. Yeah, but gravel is not.
So anyway, I was concerned about.
I'm pretty sure, we'll
yeah.
check that, but I'm pretty sure that's how it goes, because it's surprising that gravel, you would think a gravel driveway, but they don't like gravel.
Let's, one of the things I would like to codify here, or just at least for other council members that aren't here, because ultimately we go into public hearing, we have, 7 other council members, 6 other council members that are going to weigh in here. So I'm just going to try to figure out, maybe right now, take a second to figure out how we're going to, I guess what we'll do is put together just a memorandum that will articulate some of Councilor Spear's inquiries where they do, where the point was changing from the use of best management to require best management. I think we need to, be careful that within the body of our draft that we don't go forward to change those until all the
One of
council.
9.
Right. 1 of 9, but they're valid questions and inquiries. But we need to, I think, we're going to have to put something together that we'll have to think about that for more of a just these are the thoughts of Councilor Spear and
I was thinking one way to do this, and we've already talked about this with the public hearing comments, is to list the points that were raised for the board after we're finished with the public hearing. Right. We'll list the points that were raised, and then either a staff recommendation or a staff comment. And if you wanted, we could do the same with these. And then the planning board, because a lot of these, the planning board has wrestled to death in their bazillion meetings and come to some certain conclusion. And then the planning board could weigh in with, yes, we agree with staff recommendation, or we don't, and then incorporate that in the ordinance. And then when the board passes it on to the council, we could include that as an attachment. The the points that the planning board considered, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense because I think, obviously these are well thought out questions, but they may have had some valid responses as to why that didn't take place. So I would say that's probably a good way to do it, and let council members know. So when voting time comes, city council members will see what the fellow council members had concerns on, but also what the planning board felt and the staff. That probably would be the best way to deal with it. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah. All right, page 133, the bottom, performance standards. It says all construction activities and uses of buildings, structures, and land within wetlands and wetland buffers shall be carried out so as to minimize the volume and rate of stormwater runoff. Could you take out the wetland and wetland buffers? All construction in the city should be carried out so as to minimize the volume and rate of stormwater runoff.
Hey, wasn't that mentioned on, because I had that written down on page 5.
So before you find that, this section is particularly related to wetlands, so we'd have to move into a different section. But I think we're addressing it in terms of site review. We're already addressing that in those regulations, in terms of minimizing stormwater runoff. And it was all, there's a lot in the stormwater section about in the stormwater section of the site review regulations about stormwater erosion and sedimentation. But this one is really specific to wetlands activities and specific to these particular manuals and standards. So it's on page 5, you had something?
At the bottom of the page where it says no significant increase of stormwater runoff onto adjacent property or streets.
Yes, and that's for special exceptions, and that is actually a very important section that is used when we deal with that with any disputes about special exceptions. It's really an important aspect. See, what happens with these things is if in many of these areas where we don't actually have site review authority. And I should mention that one of the key changes that we're going to be recommending is that the council amend the existing site plan review ordinance, which is the ordinance that gives the planning board the authorization to do site plan review. The state allows communities to do site plan review for any residential use over 2 dwelling units. So 1 and 2 families are always exempt from that, and 3 and above can be regulated. Portsmouth has adopted a 5-unit and over standard, and we're going to be recommending that you lower that from 5 units down to 3 units, because many of these uses many of the issues that can bring up these issues are special exceptions that might have to do with 3-family or 4-family homes. And so that's an important change. That would bring us into a lot of these areas and give us a lot more review in terms of environmental rights.
So is that in here now?
In terms of the site review regulations, the draft of the site regulations at the back of your binder do state 3 units or more. And so one thing in order to enable us to enact that is for the council to adopt that change to the ordinance.
And Eric, I think if you look at page 36, that's where the site, I'm sorry, of the site review regs, that's where the issue of stormwater management is addressed in everywhere, not just the wetland. Okay.
Page 36.
36 the site reviews.
Oh,
I might get lucky.
We'll see Eric again next Thursday.
Page 134, fertilizers. I think this is great that you're limiting fertilizer use in a wetland, but again, if you look at the problems we're having with compared to Piscataqua, the Great Bay, you can read about any of these any estuaries up and down the East Coast. A lot of them are caused by nutrient overloading, and we could have these same regulations citywide. You don't have to be limited to the wetland buffer or the wetlands. So I think this concept should be expanded again. It's good for the whole city. This is there.
At the bottom of 134.
So further than that, we talked about the new sewage treatment plant's going to cost a lot more money because it's going to have to remove nitrogen, and yet we're dumping nitrogen on our lawn that winds up in the sewage treatment plant, raising our costs.
Right.
So you're suggesting, item 2 that you'd be suggesting to be applied.
Right. I guess 1 and 2, they work together,
Well,
don't they?
no, one is prohibiting any fertilizer in the most sensitive areas, and then number 2 is saying, prohibiting, allowing only low phosphate slow
Okay,
release nitrogen.
so then number 2 citywide. Slow
The
release.
question would come in, though,
Release just means it goes in slower. It's still there.
I think it's,
well, I guess the question would be probably more illegal when we get it together,
Right.
because, you know, again, we are not home rule communities, we are creatures of the state,
Sure,
and
sure.
so we need to make sure that the authority is there to do that.
I think the question is, does it go into the soil? Does it run off
Enforcement is
into
another
the
issue.
stormwater? Slow release or something like that.
Spam chasing is
So you might be right.
Well, and then the planning board has talked about that a lot, and it all becomes an issue of enforcement too.
Yeah.
You know, that you can say you can't do this.
You're gonna be
but-
the lawn police.
Well, we might have to hire some lawn police if we're gonna go that route.
And actually,
GSA fly
Because we all
over,
do
but
that.
got a green lawn is violating.
What did
It's
you
true,
say?
it's true, actually.
Fly over, use GSA.
Whoever has a green lawn, you
Whoever
know
has
they're
a
breaking.
very
the law.
green lawn is probably fertilizer.
one of the, sort of a general comment about that, we have,
Google that.
in all of our site review approvals, and we have a number of stipulations. Some of the stipulations have to do with site design, with actual physical things that are done to the site, and some things have to do with management, such as sweeping parking lots and that sort of thing. And the site design things are really much easier to enforce. You can see that they're there or they're not there. The problem is these ongoing management things. In order to enforce them, you have to go back year after year, or season after season, or month after month, to make sure they're being done. And so, any of these things that are management or operational related things are really difficult to enforce effectively. The only time you really end up enforcing them sometimes is if there's a problem.
Right.
It's kind of too late. So you have to. And we've been talking about this with some developments where we have. How do we know that they're sweeping whatever the requirement is?
Okay, continue.
Sure.
To-
Page 148. This is the off-street parking facilities. It talks about parking areas and access drives should be surfaced with a durable surface that meets the load-bearing capacity, the blah, 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 and then, materials, it lists. It doesn't list porous asphalt or porous concrete. Would that be is that a different material, or is that within the enumerated list you have? It's page,
It
that's
says
number
concrete, doesn't it?
24. Right, but we were talking about, is porous concrete the same as concrete in terms of,
Oh, I see.
this regulation?
Let's think about that.
I don't
Well,
know.
the last sentence of that doesn't address it. Pervious surfaces may be used provided that they meet the above objectives. I think we set that standard in the first few sentences and then say pervious will work if.
Okay.
I mean, if you read that last sentence
It
under
kind of
424,
includes the
yeah,
pervious.
Yeah. I think, I know the point you're making. I think it's covered.
Okay. Jared, were you going to ask about pervious surfaces for parking in general?
Yeah, I just wondered if the planning board talked about more than encouraging pervious surfaces in major parking lots. I know we did a little bit, dabbled with it years ago, but it seems like it's another one of those areas that nobody really wants to do it unless
Well, it's actually
they're
different.
encouraged strongly.
Well, but there are certain cases where we don't want to encourage. We've talked about this extensively because of, our soils in this
Right,
city.
other subsoil.
There are places where it just doesn't work and it would fail.
Right, I
Because,
understand.
where you want to have pervious is where there's somewhere to
Good drainage.
percolate down to, and it doesn't work in all cases. So we talked about that extensively.
We do have this in the site review regulations. On page 23 of site review, it says, every effort shall be made to use pervious parking and pathway services as an alternative to impervious asphalt or concrete for overflow parking areas, except in cases where it's determined that traditional impervious parking lot with engineered stormwater systems for integrated protection of surface and groundwater resources impervious pavement. So, with specific respect to the overflow areas, it specifically says pervious, and so it's encouraging that.
All right. The next page, 149, talks about parking. And I thought it was great that it was private shared parking facilities and and we had a long discussion during the work session about the future direction for downtown parking. One of the things, and I don't know if this is addressed here, but one of the things that frustrated me with parking outside of the downtown, driving down like Woodbury or Lafayette, each little retail establishment has their own fiefdom of parking, and the utilization rate for some of these parking lots is ridiculously low. And in fact, if you want to go sometimes from one store to the adjacent store with your car, you got to go out of the parking lot onto the street and then back into the parking lot at the very next door. Now they're all maybe privately owned properties, but is there any way within the zoning ordinance to get outside of the downtown to get people on these strip malls to think more cooperatively about meeting parking needs, so you don't drive down some of these roads and see oceans of asphalt that are maximally used only 2 or 3 times a year?
I think we've probably really done that best in the Gateway District,
Right.
and I think one thing that was raised in the public hearing was applying the Gateway District to other parts of the city, like Woodbury. So,
Okay.
I mean, that we can look at some of those concepts in there and see how they apply, or if we want to look at broader application of Gateway District. I mean, that will really happen when redevelopment happens, right, over time.
All right, 161 is about signage. Now, I know you guys talked about signage for a long, long time. One of the things that struck me with, and this I'm coming at it from without having done any of the background work the planning board did, but we had a talk by the editor of National Geographic Travel magazine or something, and he had a great slideshow, and one of the 2 slides in succession he showed was the signs or a streetscape of, I think it was Bow Street or Market Street or something like that, and then the streetscape of Lafayette. And it was embarrassing. It was just unbelievably atrocious. I don't know that these sign regulations do enough to, over time, clean up these corridors. And an easy low-hanging fruit is internally illuminated signs. Now I know from talking with planning board members that Rick Tainter, you've been able to show examples of aesthetically pleasing internally illuminated signs, and there are those exceptions that are out there. But those exceptions have been out there. People, obviously, from driving down these roads, don't use them that much. They use your GASL, internally illuminated sign. So rather than let the innovative sign design people, even though they have good ideas, let that drive the ordinance, I'd rather play it conservatively and prohibit these types of signs. And I think, it would take time, as things are grandfathered in, of course. It would take 20 or 30 years. But in the end, you'd have a much better, more pleasing corridor, I think. So, I don't know what Jerry or Nancy think, but thought about this a lot. I know the ideas you've been having, but
Any comment?
Oh, that's a clear policy issue. I think we it's an easy change, as you said, it's an easy change to make. It's a major change to make, so it's something that would have to be deleted.
Yeah.
No, I have no objection to it. I think that it's a tough fight.
well, I don't know, Nancy or Jerry, really, you guys,
Well, if
you're
you-
policymakers.
If you look on page 165, I mean, are you saying something like the Walmart sign is kind of pleasing because of the way it's designed? For instance, and the Service Credit Union sign, I mean, they have some aesthetically pleasing qualities to them.
These are, I think, what the issue is, because these are about size. I think the issue is more about illumination, the type of illumination.
Internally illuminated signs.
If you go to page 168, there's a table that tells you what the illumination types are allowed and by district.
Right.
And you can consider all of these things, but clearly the freestanding signs and the wall signs are the ones where you have the big impact with illumination, with internal illumination. information in most cases. And that's what really, you're talking about, that defines Lafayette Road and
Yeah.
Woodbury Avenue.
Yeah.
Has those things. And it's not just, it's a combination, I mean, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is size. And one thing we've tried to do, the board made a clear effort, is to reduce the height, allowed height of signs. And that's an area where it's going to take a long time, especially because as businesses change, they want to use the same sign pole and the same sign, or they don't want to lose sign height, or sign area, so they go to the Board of Adjustment and say, give us a variance for basically keeping what we already have. We've got a couple of variances before us tonight on sign, at least one on sign height, right? With the Dinner Horn restaurant.
Yes.
And, I can't remember the other one. The other one is the sign area. That's right. The sign area.
Verizon.
But but we have this issue. We had it with Bolorama, and we have it, I think, to a certain extent with Southgate Plaza. As businesses upgrade, they feel that part of their upgrading should be maintaining at least the same amount of information provision to the people who are driving by, and so they ask for to preserve the same height, even though the height might be non-conforming, the same sign area, the same amount of information. So I don't disagree with you. I just say that's going to be a big fight, because people, it's going to be a long process, and it's an educational process for the community to telling, to say what the difference is going to be. One of the examples that I don't know that I've shown before is I've driven through, I think it's actually Haverhill. I wasn't sure whether it was Plastow or Haverhill, but I think it's Haverhill, and I was struck by how low all the signs were. They're the same signs you see everywhere else. They're just 10 feet lower than everywhere else. It's clearly an example where a zoning ordinance was in place before the corridor was developed, and all these signs were actually brought into, came in, so they're all 15 feet high instead of 25 feet high. And so it can happen, but in a place that's already been developed, it's going to take a long time to evolve.
Well, the sooner we get started, the sooner.
I agree.
I don't know what Jerry thinks.
I'll defer to the planning board. They've had lots of work sessions on this. It's a very complicated subject. So I don't comment on piece by piece.
Very good.
Anything else? Council Spear?
Yeah. I'm very excited to see that I think we passed an ordinance, the city code, studying the possibility of impact fee, stormwater, there's the new state law, is that?
Well, that, we were doing a study on
study,
that.
we got the study,
We received a grant, and we're going to study the whole thing. We haven't done that, I mean, people understand that. We're in the process of reviewing it and seeing how it works for the community. And that would certainly come to the city council.
All right. There's no page number. Well, here on the first page on the continuing care retirement community draft. I wanted to know if it was possible, with keeping everything in the draft the same, to take out the limitation on the 62 years of age and older. Now, obviously, with the way the ordinance is written, you're still going to attract people who are either disabled or 62, who is generally that older population. So the character of the community would generally be the same. However, you would be removing the legal limitation for that. So you might have a sprinkling here and there of other generations of people. And I think that would benefit the character of that development, rather than having it strictly limited to people 62 and older. Would that cause any, I don't see how the developer would lose any money by doing that. So obviously it's been driven by a particular development.
I can tell you that's something the planning board talked about extensively, and specifically that issue was raised fairly late in the game again as to whether we should lower it by a board member. And the board, there was consensus that we should leave the age limit in there. I mean, this particular ordinance is designed to be the full continuum of care, with assisted living units, units, nursing care units, so I don't know how that would work for any particular development, but I think the board felt pretty strongly that it should be for that age group.
And actually, when we framed the discussion to begin with, one of the things that I presented was, A, do we want residential development in this district? And then B, if we want residential development, do we want all ages, or do we want only senior housing? And another question was, do we want to require affordable or not require affordable? And then we talked about densities. And one of the options that we provided was having an impact-based residential development that some communities do, where the density is based on number of bedrooms, for example, rather than on age. So that if you had more bedrooms, you'd have fewer units. And we did discuss this quite a bit. And the board, and I think basically because this is introducing a residential component into a non-residential district, the board really felt that it would only be for a limited purpose, and only for senior housing. That was really where they ended up. It was they considered whether we wanted to allow this to be a residential area, and they said no. And so the other part of it was, well, do we want to have it be a senior housing, and then what type of senior housing? And they said senior housing, but only if it's the full continuum of care, not just senior housing. So it's became very, very focused. The other, and just as a little digression, the other issue that has come up since then, was brought up at the public hearing last week, was do we want to limit this to very restrictively to the type of area that is restricted to, which is a parcel of at least 35 acres and within a half mile of the hospital. And somebody said there are other areas in the city where this could work on much smaller parcels and further from the hospital. So it's we're kind of going in both directions there.
Yeah, I added that question. It almost seems like we're creating a monopoly for affordable housing for one developer by these restrictions of 35 acres, half mile from the hospital. And why would we consider this? Why is that essential to this
And
project?
the answer is this is a city council referral to the planning board by a request from a specific developer. So,
Right, this is written,
so
this is written very site specific.
We tried to broaden this beyond what the developer was asking for,
But
we
there
didn't broaden it
are
further.
no other property, no
Well,
other 35-acre sites in the city where this can happen.
This actually is, this site that the developer has doesn't have a 35-acre parcel. It has to assemble 3 parcels to get that. And there are a number of other areas within the Office Research District where groups of parcels could be assembled together to make a 35-acre parcel. But
Well, where did 35 acres come from? I'm just curious. It seems like an arbitrary number.
it came from, because this was a city council referral for this particular developer, it was oriented in that direction. So I mean, it's clear it was based on that initial proposal of the city council, but we tried to adapt it to make it a little bit broader. We didn't make it very much broader. We tried to make it a little bit broader. So the answer is the council could say we want it to be much broader than it was asked for.
Although in a lot of ways, I mean, the area assigned, the original request, I think, was just to allow senior housing in the OR district. So we've actually made it much broader, or more, you know, I don't know if broader is the right word. But
You're right. We went both directions.
Now, is the intent to have senior housing for people moving into Portsmouth, or people living in Portsmouth currently to be able to sell their houses and live in this development? And how, certainly the pricing and development would affect whether people have to come in from outside or can sell their properties in Portsmouth and move into this development. And the reason I ask is because that type of equation goes into demographics for Portsmouth. Because if you're saying, well, this is for people who only can afford here to buy in from Boston or whatever, then by having these age restrictions, by having people come from outside, you begin to change the makeup of the city in a substantial way, because this is a substantial number of residences here. So what is the
Well,
thinking on that?
that was a large part of the discussion of the planning board also, and a large part where those who seem to be more in favor of the development pushed or sort of emphasized the aspect of people moving out of their homes in Portsmouth into the development and opening up more opportunities for other people to move into the existing homes. Those who were more opposed large percentage would come from within the Portsmouth area, but not necessarily from Portsmouth. So I mean, I think it's a mix. The intent, there's no intent, I don't think. We can't define an intent in terms of how we do the zoning, but clearly we're not going to have all of the people in there, probably not even the majority, come from Portsmouth. So,
I made a request, and I want to look at the information. It would be helpful to know what prices they expect to sell these units for, so we can compare it against
We
the
made
typical
that
house
request.
price in Portsmouth, for example, and see how affordable they really are. I asked a question about affordability. I didn't mean affordable to low-income people. I want to know who can afford to move there. Do you have to live in Tucker's Cove and sell your house to buy one of these, or can you move from Elwood Park to one of these?
We've asked the question, and we'll
Just
try
like
to
you
get
know
the
the
answer.
answer to that question.
Yes,
I
we
suppose the number of units and different price ranges on the monthly fees, and they must have some estimates. They had a couple of years ago, they did. I don't know what they are today.
Nor do we, we're actively pestering them to get an answer to that question.
That'll help. That'll help.
I think many people on the council would like to see it be an affordable complex for the person in Elwyn Clark that sells their house for $300,000 that can then move into this facility, or Maple Haven, or Woodbury Ave, or, you know, wherever. I think that's, I would guess that that's going to be a major concern for people in Portsmouth. They would like to see that that would be affordable for those kinds of citizens. So if we could
Now-
get that information, that would be helpful.
You mentioned that the planning board had looked at going just to, this is non-residential, had looked at going just to residential and did not like the idea and then moved to the senior housing as an option. What was the, and I guess your fear is by removing the 62 years of age or older, you'd be going back to just residential?
It's just an apartment district.
It's just an apartment. But even with all of these, you know, you have independent living units, assisted living units, nursing care units. If you keep all of those features of the zoning in place and simply remove the 62 years and older line, it would be very different from a regular apartment district. It would have all these other characteristics. And you'd still, people who would be attracted to this would be the older generation. The reason I mention, I keep harping on this, is that I've seen a lot of cases where you have these communities, not always continuing care, but these adult communities, where you attract, by having a language in there, you attract some people who simply don't want to be around younger people. In fact, now broader nationally, some of these communities are going through problems, going through changes, and they're having to rethink their covenants because they don't have enough people to pay the golf fees. But and it's having heartfelt discussions because people say, well, I moved here because I didn't want to be near families and be near kids and whatnot. And I don't want that type of community, little sub-community within Portsmouth. So I think having that line in there is an invitation for those people to come into that development. Having that line out of there changes the perception a little bit without changing the content of the ordinance or the development itself. So you'll have the odd younger disabled person who might be able to make use of the facilities. And from time to time, you might have someone who wanted to buy into it, for maybe they inherited it from somebody, or I don't know how they have a whole plan, I know. But anyway, I just want to make the case that you can still have everything without that line as a possibility. To me, it's a real sticking point, and it makes it harder for me to support the ordinance, everything else about it.
So, aren't there communities like that that are 55?
Well, I was going to, one point is that this is not an age-restricted community. You mentioned the places that are restricted for, and it's usually 55 and over, and the golf course type communities. This is not meant to be that type of thing. This is really, the continuum of care aspect is really oriented toward that ability to move from back and forth, independent to assisted, to nursing to assisted, go back and forth. And so, in effect, if we could define this clearly enough, you right that you wouldn't need to have the 62 and over restriction because most younger people wouldn't want to live in that type of community because it is part of nursing home and that type of thing. It's not, it isn't the kind of thing that, I mean, they have their own marketing problems right now, but they're not the same problems as the large numbers of age-restricted houses, subdivisions in New Jersey or Florida where they're having real difficulties. I'm not sure that it would hurt to take out the 62 or age or other, but I think that the purpose of it was to assure the community that it wasn't going to be a large family housing development. And so it's kind of it's almost the counterpart of what you're saying. Is you're saying that the 62 kind of has a negative implication to you, but for some people it's more of a positive implication because it says you're not going to be running out of control from a huge apartment development. So I'm not sure how we get around that. We can look at it.
Why does
I
it
think
say
it's one of those
62?
things that
It's,
we list.
it's actually, now you have.
This is the new one that you gave us.
Yeah, you have the old one. So for some reason, there's a new version and an old version. Let me
It's
give you my
not in the
copy.
new version.
The new version was sent to this week.
Here's
Yeah.
you can have that one because I can. But it's actually in the new ordinance. It's actually in the definitions at the back. And that's why it's not in the definition. It's in the definition at the back of the whole ordinance.
Oh, I
So
see.
if you go to the
Okay.
if you go to section 15 of the whole ordinance and look at continuing care retirement community, you'll see it there as defined. It's
Now-
exactly the same definition.
Well, would that apply for disabled people also? You know, I have a disabled son who's 20, and this could be a perfect environment for him, but he's obviously far away
this
from
is-
being 62.
This is actually for seniors. It's only for seniors, and it's I don't know how they deal with whether they deal with
Disabled.
We
disabled.
haven't talked about disabled this particular
Yeah.
I think this issue is one that, you know, again, we list out in the list of items
Mhm.
that we go back to the planning board with and say, revisit this again, then make a recommendation to the council, and you guys will.
We're struggling,
Have
I
we
think
discussed disabled people?
it should,
It was.
That would be-
because we're looking at the big picture of, you know, how many students we have in our school system, declining numbers of families and the city as a whole, and I'm trying to wrestle with that and trying to keep these long-term demographic changes, get a hold of them now before they take a hold of us inadvertently, because sometimes you get a tipping point and then you lack support, you know, voter support for schools or things like that.
Okay, can I just say something? It's 9 o'clock. Do you want to continue for a few more minutes, or are you almost done?
I can be done.
Okay.
I've taken up all
Because
the
what we
time.
can do is pick it up the next time. We can start with Jerry, and I have a list, and by then, maybe we can finish. And if someone else shows up, obviously they would have their turn too.
No, just we three are going to write the whole thing.
Okay, do you want to ask just a few more, or
No, no,
you want to stop now?
I can be done.
Just for procedural purposes, we don't have to close this meeting. We have the next meeting scheduled for next Thursday at 7:30 a.m. That's August 6th. Okay, and we will make sure that this information is on the web, to web stream for other council members, and we will advise other council members if they want an actual disc provided. Does anybody want a copy of this disc today? Okay.
Can I say one more thing? You mentioned the web. We actually have a page up on the web now, on the city webpage, that has a comment form that people can submit comments electronically on, as well as the telephone number, email address, and everything for submitting them in other ways as well. So there's lots of ways to submit comments for people beyond.
So should we put this on that portion of, or just a link to the web archives?
That sounds like a good
Why don't we do that, unless there's objection, we'll put it on. Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you next Thursday if you're interested in coming. We'll